Imagine you are walking through a big American city. You pass a homeless man with a shopping cart on the sidewalk. But in the blink of an eye, everything changes. Suddenly, you've been placed in a bear hug and dragged backwards into a van where two others are waiting. They hog-tie you and duct tape your eyes shut, then take you to a secluded area where you are informed that you will only be released if one of your loved ones is able to cough up hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash or property. For dozens of people living in the Chicago area during the early 2000s, this scenario became a disturbing reality. For years, a group of elite professional kidnappers operated in secret, targeting members of the city's underworld who were thought to be untouchable. Some victims were tortured, others were murdered. Almost all were treated like property, kept in a desolate area for days without bathroom breaks while the ransoms were being negotiated. But time and again, something curious happened. Just when all hope seemed lost, the very same rich benefactor stepped up to pay the kidnappers off and save the day. The victims were so grateful that they signed over their homes, turned over hundreds of kilos of cocaine, or paid him back in full in cash after gaining their freedom. The story behind this mysterious group would eventually be brought to the surface, and in the process, expose secrets of Chicago's lucrative drug trade, corruption in law enforcement, and shocking betrayals that called into question the true value of friendship among thieves. Today's story starts on July 8th, 1999, at an apartment complex on West New York Street in Aurora, Illinois. It was on this date and place that a Chicago narco cop named Glenn Llewellyn arrested Refugio Cortez Ruiz for allegedly having 10 kilograms of cocaine, after he alone spotted Refugio possessing the drugs, while a police surveillance team surrounded the complex in which he lived. Refugio would loudly proclaim his innocence throughout the court process. But as a star witness at the trial, Llewellyn would testify that he observed Refugio Cortez Ruiz poke his head out from an apartment as if he was expecting company, and eventually emerge with a duffel bag that turned out to be full of cocaine. Ruiz Cortez insisted that he'd been framed, that the drugs had been planted on him, but most people who heard this story wrote it off as the excuse of a man who was desperate to escape responsibility after being caught red-handed. He was convicted and sentenced to 17 and a half years in federal prison. A decade would go by before anyone in law enforcement entertained the possibility that Ruiz Cortez had actually been telling the truth. What few people knew at the time was that 3 years earlier, in 1996, Officer Glenn Llewellyn had signed a secret cooperation agreement with a confidential informant whose work with the Chicago police was paying big dividends, both figuratively and literally. He was the man who tipped Llewellyn off about drugs at Refugio's apartment, and he likely made $10,000 from this information. Within Chicago police sealed records, this secret informant's name was Bill Pager. To those on the streets, he was known by his real name, Saul Rodriguez. And despite his young age, he was fast making a name for himself as a charmer with a knack for networking and earning huge amounts of cash by selling major weight. Saul was a Chicago native who knew his way around the city's drug trade better than most. At just 21, he'd been busted with 13 pounds of marijuana and $8,000 in cash, and it was Officer Glenn Llewellyn who slapped the handcuffs on him. Llewellyn grew up in New Lenox, Illinois, and worked construction in his 20s. But when he joined Chicago police in 1986, it was the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. By 1996, as Saul was a rising drug dealer, Llewellyn was an up-and-coming narcotics officer. And in a place like Chicago, that meant he had his work cut out for him. Saul's arrest offered a drug cop like Llewellyn a good opportunity to break into the world of drug trafficking from the inside, and Llewellyn immediately worked to put the squeeze on Saul. With Saul still handcuffed in the back, they drove in Llewellyn's patrol car to one of Saul's stash houses, where police were actively searching. The two watched the officers from afar, as Saul pondered whether he'd rather go to prison for whatever they were about to find in his apartment, or go a different route. 3 weeks later, Saul made his choice official. He signed a cooperation agreement with Llewellyn, establishing that Saul would provide information on local drug traffickers to Llewellyn on a rolling basis. He wasn't working for free. His new supervisor assured him that he'd be paid $1,000 per kilogram of cocaine the police seized. Of course, the agreement said that Saul had to obey the law and cease all unauthorized drug dealing activities. Instead, he saw his newfound status as a paid government informant to simply turn in the competition while continuing to sell drugs like never before. Now, he'd make money from kilos of cocaine seized by narcs like Llewellyn, while also making cash hand over fist through selling cocaine in large quantities all over town. It was a kind of deal that allowed someone to evolve from a kid who'd grown up around gangs in Chicago's back-of-the-yards neighborhood into a high roller, with plenty of cash to burn and invest. But just 7 months into his work as a paid snitch, one of Saul's drug couriers was busted with 15 pounds of marijuana by the DEA, who had been secretly working with the mechanic Saul had hired to install secret compartments inside his courier cars. Once again, he could have ended up in prison if not for Glenn Llewellyn, who made a quick call to DEA Special Agent Al Dosher and got the investigation tabled. With that, he realized that he had something that few drug dealers ever experience: immunity from the law. And if there's ever a place where a drug dealer could use legal immunity to thrive, it's Chi-Town. While every metropolitan area in the United States is of course a major drug market, Chicago is uniquely situated. It is a central nervous system for numerous important freeways, railroads, ports, and a major airport. 70% of the US population, as well as the Mexico border, rests within 1 day's drive from Chicago. Inside the city itself are an estimated 100,000 gang members who may be willing and eager to make a living peddling drugs in whatever form they can. The U.S. Department of Justice has consistently ranked Chicago as either the #1 or #2 destination of America's most used imported narcotics, like heroin, cocaine, or marijuana. It should be no wonder, then, that the notorious drug lord and head of the Sinaloa cartel, Joaquin Lorea, better known as El Chapo, referred to Chicago as his, quote, home port. After all, the city helped to make him a billionaire, and 2 of its most famous residents, brothers named Margarito and Pedro Flores, played a major role in this. Known as the Twins, the Flores brothers ultimately went from ultra-rich coke dealers to snitches whose testimony proved crucial for sending El Chapo to the most secure prison on American soil. But in the early 2000s, they were cocaine entrepreneurs and responsible for the distribution of 1 to 2 tons of cocaine every single month. That kind of weight will earn you just as many friends as enemies. And one of the guys on their lengthy list of friends was Saul Rodriguez himself. Like the Flores brothers, Saul was becoming a millionaire as well, but he had Chicago's public coffers just as much as the cocaine powder to thank for it. Another one of Saul's close friends was Juan Luevano, aka Baby G, and their bond was so strong they'd made a pledge to never sleep with a woman who the other had dated. Unfortunately, Luevano allegedly broke this pact by having sex with the mother of Saul's kid, and it angered Saul so much that he set out for revenge. In October 1999, he asked Glenn Llewellyn what would have to happen for someone to go to jail for a long time. Shortly thereafter, Luevano was arrested by a Chicago PD squadron with 2 kilograms of cocaine. But Luevano's stint in jail was a brief one. He quickly paid bail and was back out on the street. Luevano likely would have been eventually sent to prison for a long time, just like Refugio Cortez Ruiz. But we'll never know for sure. That's because in 2000, Juan Baby G Luevano was gunned down outside of his home after returning from a night of drinking at a nearby club. Because he was a member of the La Raza gang, his death was quickly written off by the media as the likely result of another gang feud in one of America's most violent cities. Saul's work as an informant continued to be lucrative. From 1996 to 2001, he made over $800,000 in public funds for his work as a paid informant, enough to make him technically one of the highest paid employees of the Chicago Police Department. But apparently, this tax-free six-figure income, only supplemented by his work as a drug dealer, was not enough for Saul. So he hatched a bold plan, applying his insider knowledge of drug trafficking to form an even more devious result. He would form a squadron of gangsters, ex-cons, and drug couriers to kidnap high-risk targets who could supply millions in ransoms or stashed cocaine. And they would specifically target people with the power and resources to put Saul and his squad 6 feet under if they were ever found out, including local drug barons under the protection of the Sinaloa cartel. Saul's inner circle soon came to include guys like Fares Umar, another Chicago native who Saul knew from basketball gyms around town, or David Venegas, the husband of one of Saul's longtime drug and cash couriers, Lisette Venegas, who'd established mutual trust over the years. Then there were the Uriarte brothers, Hector, Jorge, and Manuel, a trio of guys with ties to the City Knights gang, who were so eager for access to Saul's underworld connections that Manuel had offered himself up as a hitman. But out of all of these folks, one man offered more knowledge and expertise than any others could have hoped to. This was because he knew better than the rest that the smoothest type of caper was one that didn't first appear to the victim to be a kidnapping or a robbery at all. His name was Officer Glenn Llewellyn of the Chicago Police Department. Stash houses started getting hit. A home in Will County was taken for 80 kilograms of cocaine. Another on Kenneth Avenue in Chicago was hit for $1.5 million in drug money by men who burst in with police badges, vests, and guns and duct-taped the occupants' eyes shut. The grandmother of Saul's drug courier, Lisette Venegas, who was grabbed outside a bar she owned, hog-tied and left without bathroom breaks, food, or water for 2 days until her family finally coughed up $180,000 in ransom. Lisette was fully aware of the plot and played along as her family stressed over the ransom demand. Not everyone escaped with their life. A drug supplier named Miguel de la Torre was lured to a parking garage near an apartment building owned by Saul, with the promise he'd be paid for some cocaine he'd fronted to him. Instead, he was hooked up to a car battery, burned, and eventually strangled when he refused to give up the name of his cocaine supplier, with his body left in the trunk of his Nissan and dumped in another part of town. The local owner of a rim and tire shop was bear-hugged by a man posing as a homeless person, who forcibly dragged him into a van where he was blindfolded and taken to a garage. He spent days there, begging friends and family for money, until his good buddy, Saul Rodriguez, came to the rescue. Saul had hung out at the victim's rim shop for years, and even offered to invest in it. Now here was Saul saving him from great bodily injury or death. The rim shop owner paid the ransom back to Saul through cash, wire payments, and property transfers over the next 3 years. They used these phony arrest ploys in other ways too. When someone in Saul's crew wanted to blow off a drug debt, they arranged for the person to be fake arrested in full sight of the loaner, ostensibly while he was coming back to pay back what he owed. But the loaner was not an easy dupe. Saul's response was to purchase a newer Crown Victoria and modify it to look like an undercover Chicago police car for them to use moving forward. In 2003, they'd used the Crown Victoria for one of their highest profile targets yet. They decided they would kidnap one of the twins. By then, Llewellyn had retired from the Chicago Police Department and started his own construction business. But he and Saul stayed in touch. Saul knew Pedro and Margarito Flores from playing basketball with them at the Hoops gym in Chicago. They were hard men to track down, but Saul had guys in his circle who'd buy 20 to 30 pounds of cocaine from the twins directly, and he used random tidbits of information to his advantage. For instance, When one of Saul's business associates mentioned the twins had recently purchased brand new motorcycles, he passed this information on to the surveillance team to help locate exactly where their target resided. When Saul was planning his abduction, he was also helping the twins score tickets to an Oscar de la Hoya bout in Las Vegas. The kidnapping went off just like so many others. Pedro Flores was pulled over in his light blue Lexus and arrested, only to discover, once it was too late, that he was really the victim of an abduction. While he was being taken to a secure location, someone else was getting his Lexus off the middle of the street and parking it somewhere that it wouldn't attract attention. Saul monitored the situation from a distance, concerned that if he got too close to the hostage, that Pedro would recognize his voice and he would be exposed. Instead, Saul had Fares Umar call Pedro's family from payphones and gave him a script of what to say. They told Margarito to leave a large amount of cocaine at a predetermined location while the surveillance team watched from a distance. When this was done, the group readied themselves to drop Pedro off somewhere in Chicago until they tested the cocaine and realized they'd been given extremely low-quality drugs instead of the fish scale level that they were expecting. So, Fares Umar told Pedro to get on the phone and yell at Margarito, his brother, and tell him he wasn't taking the situation seriously enough. It worked. The group was eventually given 180 kilos of acceptable quality cocaine and made $750,000 from the sales, splitting the proceeds based on who had done what during the kidnapping. After it was all over, Saul, Pedro, and Margarito bumped into each other at the De La Hoya fight and had a cordial talk. But the brothers suspected Saul and kept their eye on him from then on. Soon after their success with the twins, another victim was chosen. His name was Teodor Bueno, and the crew had pegged him as a local drug dealer who'd make an easy shakedown. Rather than his normal crew, Saul decided to use David Venegas and a local bodybuilder named Charles Dewar, who'd die of a heart attack years later. Saul deviated from his usual go-to guys like the Uriarte brothers because he figured he could pay David and Charles less. This proved to be a regrettable choice. When Fares Umar and the others attempted to pull Bueno into a minivan outside his Chicago home by disguising themselves as cops, Bueno's wife saw what was going on and rushed outside to help. The kidnappers told her it was, quote, police business, but she didn't buy that for a second and attempted to block the van in the driveway. They were eventually able to get away, but not until after she got a good enough look at the van to memorize a good description of it. Things continued to go wrong from here. After the initial abduction, Dewar decided he wanted nothing to do with this and simply walked away. Next, Bueno's wife informed the kidnappers that she'd been able to come up with the $800,000 in ransom within a few hours, a quickness that the kidnapping crew was unaccustomed to. Fares Umar was now worried that they were walking right into a trap, and even more so when on the way to collect the ransom, he noticed what he believed were numerous unmarked police cars. But Saul told him he was overreacting and urged him to plow ahead. Of course, Umar's suspicions were correct. When he arrived at the ransom drop, undercover cops made themselves known. He was taken into custody after a short police chase. In an interview room, he lied to the cops, claiming Bueno owed him drug money and leaving Saul and David's names out of the whole thing. Saul returned the favor by posting Umar's bail and purchasing him a lawyer. But Umar was no fool. He knew Saul well enough to know that these nice gestures were plan A to ensure Umar wouldn't talk. Plan B would obviously be to murder him. Because he was caught red-handed, he was sentenced to state prison for kidnapping, without ever implicating his accomplices. But Saul had other legal problems. Informants had told the DEA he was a cocaine dealer, and by 2006, the feds were zeroing in on a warehouse that Saul was renting from its owner, Glenn Llewellyn. During the raid, Llewellyn asked the feds why they were there. When he found out it was Saul, he cut ties, repaid a $500,000 investment they'd jointly put into some real estate, and also allegedly used a DEA source to verify that Saul was being wiretapped, then warned him to get rid of his phone. By 2009, Fares Umar agreed to work with the DEA. signing an agreement that implicated Saul and other members of the crew in kidnappings, thefts, and murders. The following year, the U.S. Attorney's Office obtained an indictment against Saul, the Uriarte brothers, Glenn Llewellyn, and others. Now Saul was in jail without bail, with about 20 different paths to a life sentence. So what do you suppose Saul did at this point, now that the feds had made their move? Once again, he decided to betray those closest to him. In an agreement with the feds, Saul admitted to 1 attempted murder, 14 kidnappings involving 29 victims, and the cumulative theft of 785 kilograms of cocaine and $2,783,500 in cash. He also admitted to ordering the murders of his one-time best friend, Juan Levano, Miguel de la Torre, and a Latin Kings member named Michael Snoop Garcia, whom Saul arranged to be killed at the behest of a Satan's Disciples member whose brother Garcia allegedly ran over with a vehicle. In exchange for these admissions, Saul was supposed to get a relatively lenient sentence, but he'd have to testify first. Of course, never satisfied with leaving things to chance, Saul decided to hedge his bets by obtaining a contraband cell phone and attempting to have a witness against him murdered from jail, all while maintaining his cooperation agreement with the federal government. Saul became the star witness at trial for 5 men who knew one another through Saul, had taken orders to commit violent crimes from Saul, but were now on the cusp of facing life in prison thanks to the testimony of Saul. But as the trial progressed, it became clear he was just as much help to the defense as he was to the prosecution. His long record of lying, murdering, kidnapping, backstabbing, and being willing to do just about anything when his feet were to the fire made him easy fodder during cross-examination. Ultimately, almost none of the accusations that rested solely on Saul's testimony resulted in convictions. But there were enough supplementary witnesses to convict all 5 men of serious charges nonetheless, including Glenn Llewellyn. While the jury wasn't able to reach a verdict on counts of racketeering or kidnapping, they did convict the ex-cop of conspiracy to distribute cocaine, a charge that described Llewellyn's role in the conspiracy as being actively involved in robberies and kidnappings to seize cocaine and resell it. The final result of this case was without rhyme or reason. Many of the defendants received out-of-balance punishments that didn't fit their crimes. A man named Andres Flores admitted to 2 murders, kidnapping a band leader, his wife and kids during a home invasion, and major thefts of cocaine, but only got 14.5 years in prison because he cooperated. Jorge Uriarte, meanwhile, got 42 years for involvement in 8 kidnappings and allegations he participated in the murder of Miguel de la Torre. Another crew member named Tony Sparkman, who was one of the least involved members of Saul's crew, also got 42 years for conspiracy to distribute cocaine. Even Judge Joan Gottschall, who presided over the case and handed down the sentences, thought they were unfair. Quote, "None of the sentencing makes any sense to me. I mean, we've got these people who strike me as incredibly dangerous to society who are going to get out of prison really soon." Then she brought up Fares Umar, noting that he had only 3 years left to serve, and how, quote, "very scary that was." As for Saul, it turned out that he tempted fate one too many times. While in jail, he accepted a $6,000 payment from the famous drug lord Vicente Zambada Niebla of the Sinaloa cartel, money that Saul was paid for the whereabouts of Pedro Flores and Margarito Flores, so Zambada could have the relatives killed to discourage the Flores brothers from testifying against him. Unfortunately for Zambada, this plot not only failed, but the Flores twins are now minor celebrities, subjects of a successful podcast and a biographical TV deal involving 50 Cent, all due to their work taking down El Chapo and the other leaders of the cartel. After Saul's murder-for-hire deal with Zambada became known, the feds decided they'd had enough with Saul Rodriguez. They tore up his cooperation agreement, and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison at a hearing where he blubbered and cried for 10 minutes, telling Judge Gottschall that he'd seen the light and, quote, didn't want to do bad no more. But his performance took a hit when the sister of Juan Baby G. Luevano showed up to remind the judge and the public that Saul appeared just as sincere when he showed up to Luevano's funeral in 2000, crying and ostensibly mourning a murder that he had both ordered and profited from. As for Glenn Llewellyn, after cutting ties with Saul, he had left Chicago for Las Vegas, where he found Jesus and became a church-going business owner with strong family ties, according to his lawyers. Without directly admitting to any crimes or showing remorse, Llewellyn argued that his life in Chicago was behind him, and nothing was to be gained from locking up a man in his 50s with health problems, who was sure to be mistreated when he got behind bars, and people discovered who he was. Llewellyn was given 18 years in prison, but just 7 years into the sentence, he was granted an early release and set free due to health reasons. During his time of incarceration, he filed court papers claiming that his only true crime was involvement in illegal gambling, and that during trial, he was placed in a situation where he would have had to admit to gambling crimes in order to defend himself from the RICO charges. He made this argument unironically, as if betting on sporting events was the legal and moral equivalent of hog-tying and robbing cocaine traffickers alongside men who murdered people and flooded the streets with drugs. At any rate, Llewellyn is now in his late 60s and has stayed out of legal trouble since his release, nearly 4 years ago. We'll end this story with an update on the case of Refugio Cortez Ruiz, the man who was sentenced to 17.5 years in prison after Llewellyn arrested him for possessing 10 kilos of cocaine in 1999. During the investigation, the true story behind Cortez Ruiz's arrest became known. While there were some definite indications that Refugio Cortez Ruiz was involved in cocaine, these new revelations about his arrest made the case unprosecutable. He was released from federal prison in 2009 after serving 10 years for a crime that federal prosecutors now admitted was built on the word of a man they no longer trusted. Refugio Cortez Ruiz later sued the city of Chicago and received a $400,000 settlement, less than half of what the city of Chicago had paid Saul Rodriguez as he robbed, kidnapped, murdered, and arranged for men to be framed, all while holding himself up as the most valuable police informant in town.